So, friends, a judge just ruled that one Trump-affiliated lawyer should be disbarred, and another Trump-affiliated lawyer in his disbarment trial just pled the fifth, invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination over and over and over again. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, it's been a really bad couple of days for two Trump-affiliated lawyers, John Eastman and Jeffrey Clark. And now, mind you, they're not just Trump-affiliated lawyers, they're also Donald Trump's criminal associates. They're his indicted co-conspirators. They're his co-defendants in the Georgia RICO prosecution. And if that wasn't enough, they are also his unindicted co-conspirators in the federal prosecution in Washington, D.C. for Trump trying to overturn the 2020 election. And although they are unindicted co-conspirators at the moment, very likely they will soon be Donald Trump's indicted co-conspirators in the federal case in D.C. Let's start with John Eastman. Here's the new reporting from Reuters. Headline, ex-Trump lawyer Eastman should be disbarred. California judge rules. And that article begins, a California state judge on Wednesday said John Eastman should be stripped of his law license for his efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 U.S. presidential election on behalf of Donald Trump. Eastman, a former personal lawyer to Trump, who is now his co-defendant in the Georgia criminal case over efforts to sway the election, was accused of violating California attorney ethics rules against misleading courts and making false public statements. This quote from the judge, quote, Eastman's actions were carried out with deceit or dishonesty, Judge Yvette Rowland of California's State Bar Court wrote in her 128-page ruling. She held that Eastman's plan to derail Democrat Joe Biden's election victory was unlawful and lacked any factual or legal support. Rowland presided over a disciplinary trial against Eastman last year. The California Supreme Court has the final say on all disciplinary matters. George Cardona, the chief trial counsel for the California State Bar, said in a statement that the harm caused by Mr. Eastman's abandonment of his duties as a lawyer and the threats his actions posed to our democracy more than warrants his disbarment. Eastman was separately indicted in August 2023 in Fulton County, Georgia, and charged, along with Trump and others, over efforts to overturn Biden's 2020 election win in the state. Eastman and Trump pleaded not guilty. And now, friends, let's turn to this guy. Corrupt former DOJ official Jeffrey Clark. That's him standing in his driveway after federal law enforcement authorities obtained a search warrant from a federal judge. After that judge concluded there was probable cause that there was evidence of crime in Clark's cell phone, and his phone was seized. Only the best people. Here's what's going on with Jeffrey Clark. Headline, election denier who Trump wanted to take over DOJ invokes the fifth in disbarment hearing. And that NBC article begins, an environmental lawyer whom Donald Trump wanted to take over the Justice Department in the days before the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol repeatedly asserted his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination during a disbarment hearing Wednesday. Jeffrey Clark, a former Justice Department civil lawyer with no criminal law experience, had wanted to investigate a conspiracy theory that the 2020 election was stolen, including via smart thermostats. Just hours before the attack on January 6, 2021, Trump nearly made Clark the acting attorney general, but backed off when Justice Department leadership threatened to resign en masse. Federal authorities searched Clark's home in June 2022, and he now faces criminal charges in Georgia in the state racketeering case against Trump and others. Clark surrendered to authorities in that case in August and pleaded not guilty. He's also unindicted co-conspirator number 4 in the federal election interference case brought by special counsel Jack Smith against Trump. Clark briefly testified during a disciplinary hearing unfolding this week before the ad hoc committee for the D.C. Board on Professional Responsibility, which is deciding whether he, Clark, should lose his bar license for his involvement in the attempt to overturn Trump's 2020 election loss. The case was initiated in 2022 by the D.C. Bar's Office of Disciplinary Counsel and has been held up in litigation for nearly 2 years. Before Clark's testimony, his lawyer talked about wanting to prevent him from having to repeatedly assert his Fifth Amendment right and avoid us being on MSNBC for no good reason. Once his testimony got underway, Clark repeatedly asserted his Fifth Amendment right, as well as law enforcement privilege, deliberative privilege, and attorney-client privilege. What, Jeffrey, no insurrectionist privilege? It's my editorial edition. The article continues. Patricia Matthews, a member of the 3-person panel hearing the case, asked Clark who his client was in connection with his invocation of attorney-client privilege. Quote, "For whom were you the attorney?" she asked. This from Clark. Quote, "For President Trump." Okay, friends, now, wait a minute. A DOJ official claiming that he was in an attorney-client relationship with the President of the United States? That's not the way any of this works. You know, I was a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice for nearly a quarter of a century, and we, the attorneys at the Department of Justice, don't enter into attorney-client relationships with anybody, certainly not with the President of the United States. But apparently Jeffrey Clark doesn't really know how the Department of Justice works. After all, he was the one who tried to corrupt and weaponize the Department of Justice, joining Donald Trump's conspiracy to try to criminally overturn a presidential election. You know, and I can't help to recall what another DOJ official, Richard Donoghue, said about Jeffrey Clark and what he was up to. Richard Donoghue was on the right side of the law, on the right side of the Constitution, was trying to prevent Donald Trump from criminally stealing an election. And when he saw Jeffrey Clark sticking his nose into what was going on in the run-up to January 6th, Jeffrey Clark, who was a civil lawyer, zero criminal experience, you know, Jeffrey Clark, who was in the environmental law section at the Department of Justice, when Richard Donoghue saw him sniffing around like he wanted a little piece of Donald Trump's conspiracy, Richard Donoghue said, "You know what, sport? Why don't you go back to the environmental law section, and if there's an oil spill, we'll give you a call." Okay, I took liberties with the precise language there. I don't think Richard Donoghue called him sport. But that was Richard Donoghue's testimony before the January 6th House Select Committee. That's what he said, summarizing what he said to Jeffrey Clark. But you know what, friends? Disbarment may be the least of John Eastman and Jeffrey Clark's worries. Because, as I mentioned, they are indicted. They are co-conspirators with Donald Trump in the Georgia State RICO prosecution. And based on the available evidence, they will very likely be convicted. And they will also be indicted, almost certainly. They're already unindicted co-conspirators in Donald Trump's federal prosecution in D.C. They will certainly be indicted. And again, based on available evidence, they will be convicted and they will be imprisoned. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.